Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 128. Today's guest is Anahid Nersessian. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. On today's episode, I'm talking with professor and critic Anahid Nersessian about her book Keats's Odes, A Lover's Discourse. Anahid Nersessian is professor of English at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is the author of Utopia Limited, Romanticism and Adjustment, published by Harvard University Press in 2015, The Calamity Form on Poetry and Social Life, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2020, and most recently Keats's Odes, A Lover's Discourse, a new edition of which will be published by Verso Books in 2022. Her writing has appeared in N+1, the New York Review of Books, the Paris Review, and the New Left Review, as well as in a number of academic journals. With Nan Z. Da, she founded and co-edits the Thinking Literature series at the University of Chicago Press. Now, in the book we're talking about today, Keats's Odes, Anahid takes the reader through close readings of John Keats's 6 Great Odes, providing both the context of Keats's life and the point in history in which he lived, as well as explicating the themes of each ode, using feminist and Marxist lenses to show, among other things, how politically charged these poems are. And if that were all she were doing, I think it would be a valuable book, simply because the book is written in a very accessible style that's meant for a general audience rather than academia. And honestly, I learned a lot about these poems that I'd missed when I read them in school. But what really intrigued me about this book is that it's really much more than just a discussion of these 200-year-old poems. As she puts it in the introduction, the essays, quote, tell a story, indirectly, in fits and starts, through words she borrowed when she couldn't use her own. It is a love story. But like everything else in this book, it is also about the forming of the 5 senses in this place at this time, about what is happening to us now that we have collectively reached yet another set of prospects to call unendurable. End quote. It's this story underlying the essays that truly fascinated me, how it parallels and intertwines with the discussion of the odes, giving both greater resonance to the poems themselves while also operating on me, the reader, in its own right. A couple of notes before we get started. As always, if you'd like to purchase a copy of Keats's Odes, A Lover's Discourse, I highly recommend buying it from your own local independent bookstore. But if you haven't got one of those, there are links in the show notes to buy it from independent bookstores in LA and San Diego, and from bookshop.org. Also, if you'd like to check out another example of Anahid's critical work, she has a new piece in the New York Review of Books called Catastrophic Desires, which is about the Iranian poet Farrokhzad, and there's a link in the show notes to that as well. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Anahid Nersessian. I've had the opportunity to read your book, I think 3 times now, and I...
Oh my goodness. I'm sorry.
No, it was wonderful. I actually really enjoyed it quite a bit, and I find that it's one that really does benefit from multiple reads, I think. You know, one of the things that when I was first coming to your book, this sort of question that I had about sort of the project of the book, but also why I was personally reading it, it has to do with this question that I hope isn't like a disrespectful question, but it's, you know, I often have this question about why am I going to read older poetry? Like, why do I want to read the classics? Because like, and what the utility of reading like older work is, because to me, so many of the experiences of human life are more or less universal, or, you know, at least common and recurring, but the touch points and the language that we use to describe those experiences, they do change quite a bit over time. And with someone like Keats, who, you know, most of us who are not professional romanticist critics, you know, maybe experienced once or twice in high school or college, and the illusions and sometimes even the sort of meaning and understanding of words may have changed so much that they become inaccessible to the most contemporary readers. So then I wonder, right, are these poems still communicating what they mean to communicate to people who haven't had the time or inclination to make a study of the context around them? So I guess I wanted to start here because this is something that obviously this is what you do, right? Mm-hmm. This is what you've sort of dedicated a good chunk of your life to, is the study of work that is well over 100 years old at this point. So Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That's so interesting. I think that probably one way I would want to start to open that conversation is to give you a couple of examples from my own teaching. I teach at UCLA, and off the bat, you might assume, or one might assume, that the population of the student body at UCLA, which is in Southern California, it's in an urban area, it's a very it's a student body that is like very, very hip and not at all nerdy, and they're really, really cool and interesting kids, and they're very, very politically alert. You would think, and very, very sort of very much of the 21st century. I would say that you might assume that those students, that my students, or really that maybe any students who are in their teens and 20s, wouldn't be interested in somebody like Keats. And in fact, the experience that I have in teaching is that students love Keats. They respond to Keats with a certain kind of, and that's actually been true. I've taught at a number of universities. That's true at every university that I've been at. There would seem to be very, very little connection between a young poet writing in London in, 1819, and the life of people who are of the same age, also in their early 20s in Los Angeles in the year 2022. But in fact, Keats is the poet who my students seem to respond to with the greatest intensity and enthusiasm. It seems, for whatever reason, that despite the difficulty of his language, which is considerable, and the strangeness of the world that he conjures up in his poems, he seems to be the person that speaks to them on a very, very profound emotional level. And that is true across the board. So what I mean by that is any class that I teach, that happens. It doesn't just happen in classes on romantic poetry. It happens also in classes that are much more, have a wider historical breadth. So if students are given 10 poets to read, no question, all of them will choose Keats as their favorite. So that's always been really fascinating to me, and also really edifying as well, because I kind of go into teaching Keats with a certain level of trepidation because of the reasons that you described. Oh, it's so hard. The language is so archaic. And actually, the language was archaic in Keats's time as well. Keats uses all these sort of throwback words, and a lot of his poetry involves, knights and fairies and mythological characters and all this stuff that just seems like completely alien to anything that we might be interested in now. I always go into teaching Keats with a certain degree of trepidation, and yet the incredible excitement that greets me from the classroom always fills me with joy and reminds me why I love teaching and why I love teaching Keats. So on the one hand, yes, the poetry is very old and strange. On the other hand, there is something about it that captures the immediacy and the pain and the joy of just being a human being in a way that I think not that many poets that students tend to encounter in college English classrooms do. So yeah, I mean, I will always say that, of course, we should all be reading Keats, and Keats is very contemporary. I mean, one thing that's interesting, I would want to ask you this question, if I can ask you a question.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Do you find that there are some poets, even if they're older poets, like Shakespeare or whatever, that still feel in one way or another contemporary or relevant to you, whereas other poets from the same era might feel just completely, estranging? Or would it feel that way to you if you read any poet from the 16th century? You would think to yourself, well, why am I reading this and not reading, somebody who's out of my own century?
Well, I mean, even when we talk about stuff from my own century, even, early 20th century poets, or, I guess it's no longer the 20th century, but, reading, stuff from the mid-century to even that kind of, which is a lot more contemporary, still feels old to me a lot of times. And it might be that there is, I would say that when I read work like Keats or Shakespeare or whoever, sometimes I will find myself reading like Blake or Byron but for the most part, when I'm reading for pleasure, I'm going to pick stuff that's been released in the last few years. Part of that, I think, is this sort of like existential anxiety about like, there's only a limited number of books that I get to read in my entire life. And, which ones am I going to pick? And there's something about extremely contemporary poetry that I think feels more not relevant exactly, but more exciting in a certain way. You know, like I said, the human experience, I think, is sort of constant, you know, like the sort of parameters of what human beings desire and fear and what kinds of experiences we push and pull against. I don't think that has changed a whole lot at a fundamental level for however many thousands of years we've had writing. So, you know, when I read these poems by Keats, or when I read, I don't know, like the other day I was reading Sonnet 73 by Shakespeare, which I found really funny just because, you know, he's considerably younger than I am at this point when he's writing a poem where he's sort of wringing his hands about being a decrepit old man with one foot in the grave. But it's relatable. You know, I can relate to that, and I can sort of see that. And these experiences are universal, and being able to connect over time in that way is interesting. It's an interesting experience, but it doesn't feel the same usually. Although there was an interesting thing. So you quoted Dorothy Van Ghent in the introduction. And one of the things that she talked about is this recognition of parts of herself, I think, in Keats's poems, if I'm reading that correctly. And I feel like there is that impulse. Certainly I have that impulse in all kinds of art, whether it's contemporary or classic. That was a much longer stretch of me talking than I had intended it to be.
Oh, no, but that is so interesting. I mean, I'm really fascinated by these questions, partly for reasons of style. I mean, as a person who thinks a lot about style and how individual poets transform stylistically over the course of their careers, but also, the differences between different poets who are writing even in the same moment. Because I think it's true that you can read people who are roughly contemporaries to, let's say, Shakespeare and Marlowe, right? Just to take a kind of ready to hand example, and find that Shakespeare feels, as you said, if not necessarily contemporary, at least still relevant and resonant. Whereas a poet like Marlowe might not feel that way to most people, right? So it's interesting to think about, how some poets manage. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily better, although I think most people would say that Shakespeare is probably a better poet than Marlowe, but there are some poets who manage to tap into a vein, whether we want to call it, human experience or the universal, or, I don't know, whatever we want to describe it as. They seem to tap into a vein that allows them to be discovered and appreciated anew by generations and generations of readers, where there are other poets who remain something like historical curiosities, right? Yeah, but that I knew that you were going to, as soon as you started talking, I knew that you were going to bring up that Dorothy Van Ghent quote. Yeah, she says that the poetry of Keats seems to, in a certain sense, preserve the parts of her own personality that she has had to abandon in order to survive in the world as it is. And I find that, really, really beautiful. I mean, some of that has to do with the fact that Keats himself died so young. And so his poetry, you could say, is the poetry of a young person. It has a certain kind of uncompromising intensity that perhaps Keats would have lost had he lived beyond the age of 25. And I think that Van Ghent, who's writing that book when she's, well into middle age, I think that she's describing this sensation of looking at the poetry of somebody who, in a way, never had to make the kinds of sacrifices the kind of quotidian sacrifices that you make every day as you get older, as you have children, as you, have certain obligations to your community that you don't necessarily have when you're 25. Although, Keats was a person who was obligated to many, many people in many different ways. But I think that bit by Van Ghent is so beautiful and powerful, which is why I very nearly end the introduction with it.
I think that impulse of having this, what she calls a hammering for recognition. That is in a lot of ways sort of the motivation behind this podcast. And in a lot of ways, the motivating impulse behind my own creative work. So, I am a writer and also a photographer, primarily a photographer. And for me, one of the things that always really mattered a lot to me about seeing other people's work was when I was able to recognize some piece of myself in someone else's work. It's made me feel a little less alone. And the idea that, I might be able to provide something like that for somebody else, that kind of experience was always very appealing to me. Although I'm I'm a little bit not entirely sure why, but I think also, this, I think, speaks to something that you've talked about in interviews before, and you talk about it as well in the book, that it's not necessarily obvious what reading these 200-year-old poems by a white British man would have to do with someone who was growing up in New York, Iranian American. And I think also that's also, I think, a big part of sort of this question that we always have about how we engage with the literary canon, because of all the different kinds of people that have so often been left out of the literary canon. And that is something that, for better or worse, is something that we are, I think, publishing still certainly has those problems, but it is something that is more, I think, at the forefront of what people are talking about with publishing these days. And one of the things I often find very fascinating about reading contemporary work like that, I might be able to read something by Danez Smith, a queer, non-binary Black poet who their experiences of life is probably pretty different from Keats's, but also, as you lay out in this book, not entirely. So I think there's something about that, how we do or don't choose to engage with the canon, that's interesting to me. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. I visited my friend Kaveh Akbar, the poet Kaveh Akbar had me to his class via Zoom a couple of weeks ago. And there was a person in the class who raised the exact same question as you just did. And, the question was, well, in a way, why should anybody be reading, this white British poet from 200 years ago, particularly if that's not their own identity formation, if that's not the historical experience that they've had, or their historical experience is so discontinuous from Keats's. And my answer to that actually goes back to something you said a few minutes ago about life being short. I said, I think it is 100% absolutely fine for anyone to write off any poet they want to write off. I actually really don't believe in insisting that there are some poets that have to be read for the good of, literary history. And for me, that poet would be somebody, I'm going to absolutely be crucified by traditionalists for saying this. But for me, that would be a poet like Alexander Pope, who I actually teach almost every year in the required class for the English major. I had this moment where I was teaching Pope's long poem, Rape of the Lock. And I was sitting up there on this stage and I was lecturing about this poem, and I was sort of explaining the context of the Rape of the Lock and why Pope wrote it and who it's addressed to and what the circumstances of the poem are. And even though, of course, there is all sorts of fascinating stuff to learn about, say, the couplet from Pope, right? Pope is the master of the couplet. And I understand that, and I understand why that's important to literary history, and also just why it's important to the history of poetics. I found myself hitting a kind of psychic and emotional wall with the poem, which is one I've known very well, which is one I have taught, which I think I haven't written about that poem by Pope, but I've written about other poems by Pope. And I just thought to myself, God, I do not want to teach this poem anymore. It felt absolutely dead in the water to me. It felt I don't, this word is so overused, but it felt toxic, talking about it felt toxic. Asking people to care about it felt toxic in a really profound way that I hadn't experienced before. I would never have told you, oh yes, I love Pope, because I've always had a quite, somewhat detached relationship to Pope, and indeed to most poets of the earlier 18th century. But this, I absolutely hit a wall with it. And so I told this story in the class, and I said, for me, I don't really care to read or teach Alexander Pope anymore. And other people will do that. Other people can and should do that, and God bless them. But as you said, life is short. And so maybe for some people that poet is Keats, maybe for some people that poet is, Shakespeare. I don't know, right? But I'm really wary of telling anybody how to do anything. And so if for whatever reason we encounter certain kinds of resistances in our own thinking, and the resistances don't feel productive, some resistances are very, very productive. Mm-hmm. I've written a lot about my relationship to Wordsworth in those terms. I think of myself as having I flatter myself to say this, but I think of myself as having an interesting resistance to Wordsworth's poetry. But I don't think my resistance to Pope is something that I want to spend much more time thinking about. I just kind of want to wash my hands of him, which is not to say that everybody should. But yeah, absolutely. Life is short. And I think that we need to read and engage with the things that move us, that trouble us in ways that feel as though they might be generative, that instead of just, as I said, toxic, so I'm kind of all for just saying, it's not for me. I completely embrace that approach.
So this question of the canon, I think, and how we engage with it, one of the things that came up for me while I was reading this, I think it's in your essay on Ode to Indolence. I mean, you talk about how it's just not really that good of a poem.
Mm-hmm.
And yet these are poems that are called Keats's Great Odes.
Yeah.
And so I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, what does it even mean for a poem to be great versus good? Like, can a great poem not be very good? What do we even mean when we call these poems the Great Odes?
I think partly what people mean by that is, well, for one thing, there's a kind of synecdoche going on in that half of the odes are just astonishingly good. And then the other half of them are so-so. None of them are terrible, right? But I think that we're sort of using the part to describe the whole. So if a few of them are just dazzling, we might as well call all of them dazzling. I think the other reason that the descriptor great is applied to those poems en masse is that it's simply mind-boggling that Keats wrote as many poems that became very, very famous, that are as good as they are in such a short period of time when he was so young. So partly great refers to the achievement of the writing as much as it does to the quality of any particular work.
I see. Well, that makes sense.
If that explains it. No, it's true. I mean, it's so funny when you read older literary critics, critics from the middle of the century, they're much more comfortable saying, well, this poem isn't very good. We don't do that so much these days, right? We kind of resist that sort of qualitative descriptor. But yeah, I love reading these older poets, like, or not older poets, older scholars. For example, Walter Jackson Bate, who's one of the great Keats scholars and wrote a wonderful biography of Keats, came out in the 1960s. When he's talking about the Ode to Psyche, he says something like, oh, well, the reason this poem is so bad is because Keats wrote it first, which nobody knows the order in which he wrote the poems, but that's Bates' account of it. And that's my favorite of the odes, that everybody has their preferences.
Something that you talk about in the book, and you've talked about this a bunch in other interviews, is sort of how we approach how to read poetry, I think. Mm-hmm. And you even sort of alluded to this in this conversation, that you don't really necessarily want to tell other people, this is how you have to read this, or this is what this means. One of the things that I'm thinking about is, you mentioned Kaveh Akbar. He has a thing that he said on a whole bunch of different interviews. And indeed, a lot of contemporary poets I've heard say things that are similar, even in conversations that I've had with them, where they will say that, a poem isn't something that is meant to be understood, that a poem isn't something like that. It's a puzzle that you're trying to put together, or a code that you're trying to decode. And you talk about that in the book as well, in the To Autumn essay. Kaveh Akbar has this line that I've always found really interesting, but kind of unsatisfying, where he talks about a poem being like listening to a conversation through a wall, where you may not understand every word that's being said, but you can get a lot about a lot of information still, because you can hear their cadences and you can hear the tone of their voice, and you can sort of hear the emotion, even if you don't understand the words. And I like that, but I also, for me, I always want to understand why I feel the way I feel when I read a poem or see any work of art. And something about the way that you are writing about these poems and sort of explicating them for the reader are arriving at conclusions about these poems that wouldn't be obvious to someone, I think, who had never read Keats before and had no sort of understanding of his context, of his life and times. And indeed, I think a lot of the ways that many of these poems are taught is very different from how, for example, Ode on a Grecian Urn is something that you've talked about in a lot of interviews, where how romanticists understand that poem, what you're talking about in this book, how that poem is about sexual violence, is this sort of non-controversial standard understanding. And yet, how that poem is often taught at the high school level, even at the undergraduate college level, is not really that at all.
Yeah.
And so this idea of how we read these poems, I think, is really, and how we read poetry in general is an interesting one to me, and one that I can't completely get my arms around, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, this is a question that I think about a lot, and in my own more strictly academic research, it's something that I've been very interested in. A lot of people, probably including me, would say that there is a pretty marked shift that occurs in English poetry around the time of the Romantic period, where poetry, or our expectations of poetry, or poets' expectations of their own work, shift from being, if not always committed to conveying information, at least having the idea that that's something poetry can do, to a slightly new idea of poetry as something that operates on its readers in a much more oblique, and I hesitate to say emotional, but let's say an oblique and emotional or embodied way. So Wordsworth, when he writes his preface to Lyrical Ballads, which is a book of poems that came out in the 1790s, he, first of all, overtly tags those poems as experimental. He uses that word. He says the majority of these poems were written as an experiment. And that is the first use of the word experiment to describe an aesthetic quality in the English language. So our use of the term experimental as in experimental art comes from Wordsworth, really. And he then goes on to say that what poetry does is it discombobulates you on a physical and cognitive level. And what is conveyed by the poem is not actually any bit of information, whether historical or biographical or descriptive or anything like that, but rather something that operates on your senses in a way that hopefully, if the poetry is good, has some kind of positive moral outcome. And he's sort of vague on what that is. Maybe it makes you feel more connected to other human beings. Maybe it renovates, it's a word Wordsworth really likes, maybe it renovates your emotions when you've been sorrowful or depressed. But it's not the poetry that is, it is not intended to give you a piece of data about the world. And that's the idea of poetry that I think to a certain extent we're still working with. But it's important to recognize that that's not what poetry always was. And that for, thousands of years, there were very, very different poetic traditions that were at times even dominant over the one that, Wordsworth ends up kind of picking up on and elevating to the status that he does. So I'm interested to hear you say that, you want more from an explanation of how poetry works. I actually have a very similar experience to Kave's. I often feel as though poetry is something that I'm hearing, underwater. And I like that. I like that quality. I actually like the sense that I don't quite know why something has had the effect on me that it has. I think that I can sometimes kill a feeling, whether it's an aesthetic feeling or just something that's happened, in real life, by figuring out exactly why I've responded to it the way that I have.
I think for me, my training and my day job is as an engineer. So I'm always sort of trying to take things apart to understand how they work. Although I think my concern here is less with what the poet is trying to say and more with how did the poet make me feel the way that I feel, I think those are slightly different. But then again, I do feel like there is at least a potential value to trying to understand the meaning of a poem, whatever, Walt Whitman might say. And especially when I'm considering the kinds of discussion that you're having in this book. When I think about a poem like Ode on a Grecian Urn or To Autumn in particular, how easy it is and how many people do, including teachers, come away with an understanding of the poem as meaning exactly the opposite of what you're discussing the poem actually meaning. And it's something that there's a similar thing that happens with I'm thinking about the movie, I can't remember the director's name, but he did RoboCop and he did Starship Troopers, where people watch a movie like Starship Troopers and just completely fail to understand that it's meant to be satire and that it's meant to be upsetting and it's meant to be, you're not supposed to like these characters. They're supposed to be literal Nazis. And yet most people who just watch Starship Troopers, they completely miss out on that because the allure of it, the allure of the action, the sexiness of the actors is so overwhelming that it just provides you so much opportunity to misunderstand it. And people do. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm thinking about what a poem does in the world, what a poem means, what the utility of, talking about the utility of art is maybe a little crass, but like, what does it mean for a work of art to be so easy to misunderstand? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that that's a different question from what does it mean for a work of art to be interpretable in many different ways, right? Mm-hmm. There's two really, they're overlapping questions, but they're importantly distinct. So I've never seen Starship Troopers, but I have seen RoboCop, but I've never seen Starship Troopers. But when you were talking, I was thinking about Milton's Paradise Lost, which very famously inspired both William Blake and Percy Shelley to say that the hero of the story is actually Satan, who, if you read the poem, it's very hard to miss that at least on the surface, Satan is meant to be the villain. But for Blake and Shelley, the idea was, in fact, I think it was Blake who said Milton was on the devil's side without knowing it. So the implication there is that the author themselves, right, could have created something that they think is going to read one way and they want to read one way. In fact, it could have a completely different interpretation to other readers, perhaps at a different historical moment, or just readers who were coming, as Blake and Shelley were, from a different political perspective. So that poem actually becomes very, very important to what we would now call left-wing or radical romantics, because they see the figure of Satan as a kind of revolutionary. Whereas if you read Paradise Lost, you'll see that Satan is actually portrayed as a kind of false revolutionary, sort of false prophet of democracy. Because I'll stop talking about Milton. But so that's actually, I think that's maybe different from the Starship Troopers case or the Ode on a Grecian Urn case, where you have people just outright misreading. When you said earlier that you are a photographer, that's my forgotten profession. I wanted to be a photographer as well, and I did a lot of photography when I was younger, both in high school and in college. And for me, the motivation was the same as being a literary critic. It is to see something, Mm-hmm. Just to see clearly, right? That I feel is if I had, it sounds very grandiose, but if I had to say, well, what's my, greatest object in life, I would say, that's it, to see things as they are, to see things clearly. And to, if this doesn't sound even more grandiose, to give others, whether it's human beings or poems, to give others the gift of being seen. Because most of us feel very unseen, right? Most of us feel as though people are always getting us wrong or overlooking us or distorting us in various ways. So when I hear that somebody teaches Ode on a Grecian Urn as a poem about the, eternality of art, or they teach Ovid's Metamorphosis without mentioning the fact that the poem is structured around a series of narratives detailing sexual violence in quite graphic and upsetting terms, I'm just baffled by it. I'm just baffled, because it seems to me like a very, very straightforward denial of one's own capacity to see what is before one's eyes. And in the case of individual teachers or individual readers, there may be, for all we know, psychological reasons for that. They may also be lazy. They may also have fallen into a certain kind of way of seeing the world as like a basically good place, where bad things happen, but only rarely. And, things like, say, sexual violence or, the horrors of war, anything else that you could mention, that those are in some ways exceptions to life rather than the things that make life as we know it run the way it does very well for some people, right? And very badly for most other people. And so I always find it really kind of drops my jaw, because I don't understand why you could read, or understand how anyone could read a poem like Ode on a Grecian Urn, which is, as you said, very, very straightforwardly, at least in its first part, descriptive of acts of sexual violence, and not bring that into your own interpretation of the poetry. It baffles me.
Well, I guess with that poem, I think, it's I think easier to arrive at that conclusion just from the poem itself. But, considering a poem like To Autumn, which, and in your essay, I think a lot of the essay that draws on an understanding of contemporaneous events that Keats would certainly have known about and thought about, I think that poem is a lot easier to, like, as you say in the essay, it's a perfect poem and it's intensely beautiful. Yeah. And the sort of beguiling quality of that beauty is in large part the point of the poem, as you explain in the essay. And yet it is, I think the problem of it is that it is so easy to be dazzled and beguiled by that beauty. Exactly. And this is a problem, I think, in a lot of art. Certainly photography has this problem a lot, where people, I think, still haven't fully reckoned with, you know, as an art form, fully reckoned with exactly what the function of beauty is in the work. There was a really famous, I can't remember who the essayist was, but sort of critique of Sebastião Salgado's work around, war images that are beautiful, and like how easy it is to just think about, these images of, desolate nature or of war are really beautiful, and how easy it is to miss, because you get lost in that beauty and miss how horrifying the images actually are when you take them in the context of what they're actually depicting. And what To Autumn is depicting is even less obvious than that, I think. Right. So that's a poem that's like really, really easy to misunderstand. And it almost feels like deliberately easy to misunderstand. I don't know how that strikes you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. I think that, it's so hard to know what Keats was thinking in that moment when he wrote To Autumn, other than what he said in the letter that he wrote when he was composing it, namely, it was a really beautiful day and I wrote a poem about it, and that's very oblique, and it's the same message. I mean, that's the wrong word, but it's the same vibe that you get in the poem. Oh, it was a beautiful day. Here's a poem about it. Right. But I think that it's true to some varieties of human experience, that the world can be at once extraordinarily horrific and also very, very beautiful. These things coexist. And rather than suggest that, that the beauty actually redeems the horror, Keats, I think, is proposing that we do, or come to an even more uncomfortable recognition, which is that we are actually incapable of fully stomaching the atrocities that are happening all around us, perhaps even to us, every single day, every single minute, that there's a kind of limitation to our human capacity to take in what is real. So moved are we, so tuned in are we, so drawn are we to beauty. And then at the same time, that is a really important thing about being human, because if we didn't appreciate beauty, if we had no capacity for joy, if we had no desire for life to be better for ourselves and for others, then we also wouldn't be able to experience the injustices of the world with as much acuity and intensity as we do. So these two things are always wrapped up together for Keats. And I think that that's ultimately what the poem is about. Though, as you say, it's hard to tell, it's hard to tell. That's why in the case of that poem in particular, thinking of it as written in a very, very specific historical moment, namely after the Peterloo massacre, this massacre of unarmed civilians during a peaceful protest, is as important as it is.
Some of the things that we've touched on in this conversation are poetic obliqueness and how to read a poem. And sort of, I think what I'm sort of circling around to is considering this book as an object unto itself. One of the things I think, this obviously has stood out to a lot of different reviewers and interviewers that you've spoken with, how the book, it's not simply straightforward criticism in like sort of a scholarly kind of way. And you've talked before about how the book was more or less commissioned to go along with the 200th anniversary of Keats's death. You could have written a book for a general audience that is still just that, right? Just sort of talking about the poems on their own terms. And even something like the way that you include a sort of personal experience in the essay on Grecian Urn is sort of more straightforwardly relevant to understanding context of the poem itself, I think, like that giving this account of this experience with your high school Latin teacher sort of makes the discussion about what's happening in the poem, like it ties it all together with exactly the question that I asked at the beginning, like why are we still reading a poem like this? Like that's really old, because obviously this is an experience that still happens and it is still relevant. And we have not yet figured out how we're going to, answer these questions that the poem is raising. But, in other parts of the book, the way that you bring in personal experience is a lot more oblique, and it's not easy to understand how it's related to the poem. And in some cases, it almost feels entirely parallel, at least to me. Mm-hmm. And I can't help but think about how the structure of the book in the introduction, you lay out very explicitly, this book is a love story. Like, I'm pretty sure you say that almost verbatim in the introduction. And you end the book with a very personal, very sort of lyrical postscript that you've described in your conversation with Michael Robbins. I think you described it as sort of taking the Jenny Marks letters and putting them in your own voice. I can't help think of the way that the structure of the book and the way that it's so explicitly pointed out in the introduction, that this book is a love story, as sort of like an invitation to take it strictly on those terms and to try and figure out what the story actually is. And yet we're also throughout the book, and in our conversation here, talked about how, Keats's poems aren't codes. They're not riddles to be solved. And there is something really fascinating to me about this, especially in the postscript. It really doesn't feel like a comment on Keats at that point. It feels like a summation of something more than just a series of essays about some famous poems. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a great kind of like series of questions or themes, I think, to put on the table in relation to the book. And it's really helpful for me because I can't remember if we talked about this or not, but I have to write a new introduction to the book because Verso is putting out a new edition of it later this year. So I kind of have to think about the book now in the aftermath of its writing, in the aftermath of its reception. And one of the things that I have been coming back to a lot is something I didn't realize when I was writing the book, but I think that I can see it much more clearly in retrospect. Namely that I wanted the book to be intimate and personal without necessarily being invested in or relying on self-disclosure. So what I mean by that is, as you said, the chapter on Ode on a Grecian Urn, talks about this experience of being harassed by my Latin teacher when I was in high school. And that is very straightforwardly biographical. It has plenty of details. It, if not quite transcribes, at least describes, actual conversations that I had, actual things that were said, the actual fallout of that particular situation, which sucked in various ways, right? But that nonetheless feels like a kind of discrete experience to me. Whereas the thing that I describe in the beginning of the book as a love story, and that is very much tied up in my relationship to Keats, feels much more diffuse and disorganized and atmospheric, and a little bit more difficult to put into concrete narrative terms. And I don't think that being unable to put something in concrete narrative terms means that it's necessarily vague or less true. I think that the aspects of our experience that are ambiguous and indirect are as real as the aspects of our experience that are very cut and dry. And so it's interesting to me when people read the book and they say, as some people have, oh, I wanted more detail. I wanted more personal detail about the love story, or I wanted more specifics in the chapter on melancholy about like what the hell is being described, or what the hell is being recounted. And I think that, of course, is a valid response. I mean, it's a valid response as any. But I also kind of, oh, I'm sorry, you're going to hear an airplane going above my head. But I also am really curious, just in my own reading as well as my own writing, about the ways that intimate experience can be registered as a series of inflections or a mood or again, a kind of ambience or poetics, if you want to call it that, as opposed to a very, very straightforward account of, this happened and then that happened. And so the end of the book, it's funny you say, oh, well, it's not about, he's Shiku Reddy, who's a friend of mine and who I did I did a conversation with him when the book was launched. He speculated that that the end of the book, the postscript, could have been an address to Keats. And that hadn't occurred to me at all, but I loved that had come across his mind as a possibility, and I think that that's as available, as a reading of the ending as any other. So some people do think it's about Keats, which I love.
I do see that reading, and I think that there's a way to read, especially since, you both in the book and in a lot of interviews, you talk a lot about apostrophe and about, addressing that which can't respond back. So, I think there's that reading is available, I think, for the whole book in a way that you could in some ways see, if an ode is a poem of praise, that we could read the book as a form of praise towards something that can't respond back. Mm-hmm. But, I guess what I'm sort of thinking about here is not necessarily when I say trying to figure out the love story, it's not that I think that it's important I don't think the book should be a novel, right? I don't think that the prose is intended to, I think when we're thinking about what a work of writing is, you have to take it on its own terms, right? Like if it's not disclosing a linear narrative, there's a reason for that, and you have to respect that, right? And so asking for more details is, I don't know. To me, it's like an inappropriate way of reading it, even though I know a lot of people do. In particular, people do that a lot more with women writers and queer writers and writers of color. But
thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. I believe that is true.
There's this whole thing about like people wanting to know about Alexander Chee has written a whole bunch about why this question is both kind of like presumptive and tiresome.
Yeah. Of course. And invasive, right? And also, also unimaginative in a certain way, right?
Yes.
You're asking somebody to provide you with more detail in this kind of passive, but also quite demanding way, like, well, give me more. It's almost like you're sort of sitting in front of Netflix and you're like, well, what else can I get out of you?
Right.
And I think as a writer, you want to say what you can get out of me is on the page.
Right. Exactly.
That's what I'm willing to give, and if it's not enough for you, it's not enough for you, but like, I can't do anything about it now. Right.
Right. So for me, when I'm thinking about the sort of more personal and lyric aspects of this book, it's not that when I'm saying I'm trying to figure out the love story, it's not that I'm trying to divine the details that have been omitted, because as I say, I think that's inappropriate. And as you say, I think that's kind of boring, right? Like it's not what the point is. But rather, I'm interested in understanding how it functions in the book and how it functions on me, right? Like I couldn't necessarily come away with some kind of easy summary of what I think the intention is behind those sections. I couldn't come away with an easy summary of even exactly how they make me feel. But I'm interested in knowing how they operate on me as a reader, and also, I certainly do have a response to those passages, and it's not exactly the same response that I'm having to the Keats's odes, and it's not exactly the same response that I'm having to the prose explicating Keats's odes. It feels different to me in a certain way. Now, you had a conversation with Zoe Kazan last year, and in the introduction, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he introduced your book and the conversation by talking about this willingness to let fragments of your personal life come in. And what he claimed was that I have the quotation here. He says, on the other hand, a willingness to let fragments from her personal life function as mirroring shards that capture reflections of Keats's own passion, his love, and his vulnerability. And this would be the autobiographical or memoiristic mode, although neither word is quite right. It's more accurately like an openness to risk, the risk of self-exposure, not gratuitously, but as a hermeneutic, as a key to a fuller reading of Keats's work. And I thought that was an interesting thing to say that these passages are operating as a hermeneutic, but I also feel like it's incomplete because the way that they operate on me is more like the way the poems are operating on me than the way that the prose is operating on me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, one of the things that I say at the very, very beginning of the book in the preface is that if you haven't read anything on Keats's Odes before, this book shouldn't be your first stop. And I say that because it's a very idiosyncratic take on the Odes. And if you wanted something more straightforward, there is a wealth of just incredible time-tested scholarship on all of Keats's poetry and the Odes in particular. So, for example, Helen Vendler's The Odes of John Keats is absolutely just, like dazzling book that will take you through the Odes and, will take you by the hand and guide you through this very, very difficult poetry. And you'll come out of it knowing so much more than you ever could have imagined about the Odes, about Keats, about poetry, And so I would much rather, if somebody's never read Keats before, that they read Helen Vendler first, and then, they can come to me, several books down the line. I think that there's a connection between that claim and the way that the more personal or autobiographical elements of the book work. What I was very, very keen not to do in any part of the book, from the accounts of the poems to the accounts of my own life, was offer anything like the last word. So I don't want to give the first word on Keats, but I also don't want to give the last word on Keats. And that's just true of my criticism in general. I never want to give anybody what I think to be the definitive reading of a poem. But I also didn't want to write those more intimate moments as though I were trying to really put a stamp on it and say, this is what happened. It goes back to that idea of resisting linear narrative. I didn't want to tie things up and say, this is my take and my take is true and my take is the only take, or like, this is my take and all other takes must exist in opposition. That was not interesting to me at all. I mean, that just seemed like a kind of both, like intellectual and emotional tyranny, if that's not too strong a word. And I wanted to let those moments of the book operate, you say they kind of operate like the poetry, which I think is really beautiful. And I'm really grateful for that reception of them. Yeah, they can operate as, questions rather than conclusions. And, poems work like that too. Poems are also questions rather than conclusions.
There's like a whole bunch of stuff that I still wanted to ask you, but I think we're actually past the normal segment length. So we need to take a break and do the second segment.
Sure thing. We're too busy shooting the breeze. Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which can be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Let's talk a little bit about the experimental critical writing. Does that sound okay?
Sure, yeah. So tell me all about it.
So I've been teaching this workshop. I've taught it a couple of times or a few times on experimental critical writing. I first taught it via Zoom at a venue called Wendy's Subway in New York City, which is a really fantastic place and people should check them out. But it's been so incredibly gratifying, first of all, to be teaching in a slightly different mode, where I'm actually working with people on their writing as opposed to delivering parcels of information about English poetry. And so that's one thing. It's a really different way to be a teacher. But I've also found that it helps me bring to a level of self-consciousness aspects of my own writing practice that for the most part are totally intuitive. I mean, I'm the worst person to ask about craft, I'm the worst because I really experience it as a kind of, like, I don't write in a fugue state, but I do feel in a way like again, this just sounds totally, bananas, but like I do feel somewhat possessed. Like I don't necessarily feel like I'm making choices on my own accord. I feel like I'm just kind of guided, into this direction or the other. I mean, it actually, it goes back to something we were talking about vis-a-vis the Keats book. You said in the case of the chapter on Ode on a Grecian Urn, bringing up this aspect of my personal experience illuminates or grounds aspects of the poem in a way that perhaps otherwise might have remained in a slightly more conjectural register. But that was totally unpremeditated. I was just sitting there writing about Ode on a Grecian Urn, and then suddenly into my head pops this, memory of having been, propositioned by my high school Latin teacher. And then I thought, oh, okay. And I just started writing it, so this kind of stuff unfolds for me, this kind of stuff, which I mean writing, unfolds for me in a very, very unconscious way. And so when I was first asked to teach a workshop on experimental critical writing of the kind that I increasingly do, I thought, God, do I even know what it is that I do when I write? And I decided that I did not. And so then I started reflecting on it in a much more deliberate way than I ever had. And that was actually, that was helpful to me, and hopefully it was helpful to the students that took the class. But, it's always interesting to suddenly be forced to articulate your habits in a very, very concrete way. We do so much stuff just without thinking about it every day. Like if I said to you, okay, like what do you do every single morning?
Yeah.
you would kind of probably, if I said to you, what is your thought process in the morning?
Yeah. So much of it is just completely automatic.
But some of it would be easy. I get up, I feed the dog or whatever. I don't know if you have a dog, but like I get up, I feed the dog, I, make my coffee, I make breakfast, I do this, I check my email. Some of that stuff is very concrete, but what if somebody asked you to map your emotional terrain from, the moment you get up to the moment you do your first task? You would actually probably have a bit of trouble, right?
Yeah. Well, it's so much of it doesn't even really involve conscious thinking, it's sort of being, because I'm not fully awake yet.
Yeah. And like weird feelings, right?
Yeah.
I mean, from the moment you open your eyes how the morning's going to go, right? I mean, if you feel good, if you feel crushing despair, if you feel nervous, if you feel excitement, and those things are happening, in your mind before you're aware of them, but then they immediately color your day.
So I'm interested to sort of, how do you then approach trying to teach something to someone that has for yourself been, largely unconscious?
Yeah. So I begin usually by teaching an exercise that I have stolen, or that I originally did with the writer Renee Gladman, who I talk a bit about in the Keats book, who's just an extraordinary writer. I attended a few years ago a conference on experimental critical writing that was organized by Lauren Berlant, who, was a cultural theorist and who died about a year ago. Lauren was my advisor in graduate school. Lauren had organized this conference and had invited all these incredible writers like Renee Gladman, Barbara Browning, Fred Moten to come and teach or perform, or, just kind of work through in public some aspect of writing both critically and experimentally. And Renee Gladman had us do this exercise, which still astonishes me to this day. She played John Coltrane's Olé. I don't know if you know that.
I don't know that one.
Piece. That's, obviously incredible, right? So she played Coltrane's Olé and asked us to write about the piece without using any words that are obviously associated with music or its description. So you couldn't say loud, you couldn't say bass, you couldn't say, right? So you can't name an instrument, you can't talk about dynamics, you can't talk about tempo, you can't talk about rhythm, you can't use those words. So how do you describe a piece of music without being able to use that vocabulary, the vocabulary specific to the description of music, right? Be the same thing as saying, okay, like we're going to describe this painting to me, but don't talk about shape, don't talk about color, don't talk about texture, don't talk about what it represents. Just don't talk about that stuff. And at first, you sit there, and I think she played it twice, and it's fairly long, it's about 20 minutes long. I think she played it twice. And I think, if I remember correctly, that the first time we were kind of just supposed to listen. But of course, everybody who's sitting there listening is slowly panicking about what they're going to do when they actually have to write about it, during the second playing of the track. And you could just feel everybody's like a room full of, very smart people, writers, academics, right? And everybody's having a kind of low key panic attack. Like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? How will I get an A on this assignment? And so the track ends, and then it's okay, now we're listening to it again, and you're going to put into language what this thing is. And all the conventional, customary vocabulary has been completely taken off the table. And the first thing that you experience is a kind of abject terror, right? And that in itself is funny, because it's not as though you're not doing it for a grade. You're not in high school anymore. You're not going to turn this in and, like, get an F on the assignment. Like, no one's even going to see it. Although I think we did have to show our whatever we'd come up with the person sitting next to us. But, like, there's no stakes. There's no consequences, but people are terrified at the idea of their own incompetence, terrified by it. Me, most of all, or me among their, like, absolutely terrified. So, whatever, I did the exercise, and I just remember feeling, and I can probably count the number of times that I have felt my consciousness around something change in real time on one hand. And I remember sitting there and thinking, oh, I could also write about poetry like this. What if I didn't write about poetry as though it were, as it often is, a lexical or verbal object? What if I wrote about Keats's To Autumn as though I were writing about a painting, or as though I were writing about, Coltrane, or as though I were writing about walking down the street, or whatever, that suddenly I realized that there didn't have to be this one-to-one correspondence between the poem and my writing about it, even though, in the most basic sense, the poem uses words and I write in words. And that just blew my mind open, completely blew my mind open. And at the time, I was working on my second academic monograph, which is called The Calamity Form. And you can see, or at least I can see quite clearly, a difference between the first chapter and the introduction, which I had written before this workshop, and the chapters that came after it, particularly the chapter on Wordsworth. And to a lesser extent, though, I think probably also in a marked way, the last chapter, which is about John Constable's cloud paintings. And it just completely changed. It was like it changed my life. I mean, not to be ridiculous, but it changed my life. And so when I teach my own workshops, we always begin with this exercise. And it's just astonishing what people come up with. It's astonishing to see people translate an aesthetic object, when we're trained, if this is the kind of thing we do for a living, but also we're trained just as, students in high school, even before that, in college, whatever, we're trained to use a very, very specific regime of description when we talk about works of art. And to destabilize that is astonishingly powerful. So it's always incredible to me, because I always project like the terror that I had in that moment onto the people that I'm teaching. And I'm thinking, oh, they're all freaking out, because I freaked out so hard. And I think some of them probably are freaking out, but then they share what they've come up with and it just knocks you flat, So that's the first thing we do. And I still always, when I'm stuck, I will do that exercise now for myself. If I'm really stuck on something. And then, we sometimes do things that get a little bit farther afield. So I think I mentioned this to you, I've been reading tarot cards for a very, very long time, since I was 12. So for a really long time, for like 25 years. And I've become more and more interested in trying to integrate that part of my life, which I always kept very separate from my academic life and my life as a writer. I've been trying to integrate those parts of my life a little bit more. And so I do a lot of exercises in these workshops around tarot. And that turns out to be really, really exciting for people as well, because there's a kind of tarot's become very trendy right now. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I actually think that's really exciting. I mean, I think any kind of, technique of self-inquiry, should be as widespread as possible. And I think that's essentially what tarot is. So, we do things like the great sort of theorist of tarot, a tarot scholar, Rachel Pollack, will sometimes ask you to contemplate a card and decide what action the card is compelling you to take. So I'll sometimes say to the students in my experimental critical writing workshops, look at your object, whether that's a photograph or a piece of music or whatever it might be. Look at your object and ask yourself, what action does it compel me to take? So I've translated that exercise from a slightly more occult domain, if that's the appropriate word, if it's from kind of occult or metaphysical domain, into the domain of critical writing. And in that case, you also get just really remarkable responses. I think that in every case, the point of the workshop, or what I hope that it does, is to encourage people to use this word again, to kind of translate their object, whether it's translating it into another medium, as in the exercise where, like you write about the painting as though you have no vocabulary associated with painting, or you're translating the object out of, the realm of sort of aesthetic closure, right? It's this object and I confront it and it may speak to me emotionally, but it doesn't actually speak to me the way a human being would speak to me. And now imagine that it actually does, and imagine that object actually does have some kind of will that it would like to exert upon you, or imagine that it has a request that it would like to make of you. And how does that change what you believe it to be? So I love doing it. And it's just, I really love teaching in general, but I really love teaching that workshop.
You know what this all kind of reminds me of? There's this really famous quote that I think is usually attributed to Lester Bangs, but I think is not actually him, where the person said that talking about music is like dancing about architecture. And then I remember this was probably like 10 or 15 years ago at this point, when I was still reading webcomics a lot. There's this webcomic called Penny Arcade. And there was a blog post that went along with one of those things. Penny Arcade's probably not something that I necessarily want to like take as some kind of any kind of
the oracle,
right? Yeah. They've done a fair number of problematic things, but you don't learn these things when you're in your 20s sometimes. So, but anyway, he said this thing that I thought was really interesting, where he said something like, for him, that quote doesn't so much highlight the ridiculousness of talking about music, but more it makes him think that at some point somebody is going to dance about architecture, and he's afraid that he's going to miss it. And it makes me sort of think about how trying to translate one form into another that way, or talk about things in a way that isn't in their sort of native vocabulary, probably opens up some really interesting avenues of inquiry. And so, like, why couldn't we dance about architecture? What could we learn about architecture that we couldn't know through any other way but dancing about it?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, when you pulled out the Lester Bangs thing, I thought, well, because he's saying that like it's a bad thing, right? Like it's a mark of a certain kind of impossibility, right? We'll never really be able to say something about music that actually meets it on its own terms, right? And instead of thinking of that as, again, marking some kind of tragedy, so always will be distant from us, or, we'll never be able to really articulate, it in the sort of perfection of its own of its own essence, or like whatever, it's like, great, what an opportunity, because we're actually not trying to reproduce the object. We're trying to make something new.
Yeah.
Right. And that doesn't necessarily mean that when I write about Keats, that my literary criticism is as good as Keats's poetry. I don't think that it is. I would much rather you read Keats than me, but you are trying to do something new.
Do the same thing either, though, right?
Yeah. It's not trying to do the same thing. It again, and to go back to what we were saying earlier, it's a kind of, magical irony that, you might be able to see, for example, a poem more clearly if you don't think of it as an exclusively verbal object, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there may be some kind of unveiling that happens when you free yourself from the obligation to consider only the language of the poem, you know, or if you free yourself from the obligation to consider it as a thing that is only made of language and is only going to provoke the same kind of language in you.
Mm. You know, another thing that came up for me while you were talking about the like sort of methods you use in this workshop, thinking about tarot and how it's sort of trendy right now. I was also thinking about, I mean, I think in general, sort of a lot of spiritual practices or occult practices are just sort of generally more a part of the zeitgeist in pop culture than they had been previously. Things like astrology or there's a whole thing about, you know, I was going through some personal stuff over the past year, and somebody recommended me a series of moon rituals. And for me, you know, growing up the way that I grew up, sort of completely non-religious and becoming sort of agnostic as an adult, and also, as I mentioned, I'm an engineer, so I tend toward the sort of literal ways of looking at the world. I don't know if personally I'm like willing to accept fully that things like you know, performing a moon ritual is going to do something cosmically in the universe. But what I do find, and similarly for tarot, like I don't know if I'm necessarily revealing something about the universe when I interact with or engage with a tarot deck. But what I do find is that it's a really interesting way of organizing how I think about myself, and that using these tools to sort of get myself out of my sort of normal way of thinking and sort of providing sort of a slant way into the same experience can provide a lot of really interesting insights that then help me move forward in the rest of my life. What kind of this is making me think of is, so both as a person reading a form of this experimental criticism that you're talking about, that having this sort of slant way into it can help the reader understand, provide an interesting experience for the reader, right? But also that I guess I just sort of wonder, and this bears on the book as well, how approaching these things in this sort of slant way and potentially including something a little bit more personal in the understanding, right? Like that the understanding that could come from a tarot deck is going to have some more specifically, it's going to involve some sort of more specific to the writer, you know, how they're going to interpret that, and opening that, how that can opening something up from in your own engagement with the thing that you're writing about, you know. Like one of the people that I think a lot about when I think about, and if this isn't scholarly criticism, but it's a different form of criticism, right? But like I think about Hanif Abdurraqib's music writing. I don't know if you're familiar with his music writing, but his music writing is always just really intensely personal. Like he's really writing a lot about himself when he's writing about the music. And yet, even though I have never lived his life, I always find that I come away from, as a reader, when I understand what this music meant to him and why it meant this to him, that it's a completely different way of approaching the music than I would have had coming to it sort of on my own. And it seems like this is sort of doing what you're describing here, is sort of doing a similar thing for the writer as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking about your description of the chapter, and I actually don't know if this was the chapter on Ode on Melancholy that you were thinking of, though I suspected it was. You described the critical writing and the more personal writing as running along parallel tracks. You know, so it seems as though there's no obvious point of connection between them, but they're paired in some way. I think that the classic sort of Freudian understanding of the unconscious would be that the unconscious is running along a parallel track to our conscious mind. You know, so you're thinking, I'm furious at this person who flipped me off on the highway, but unconsciously, it also reminds you of some, difficulties that you've had with your father, right? For example, right? Which is why you're more pissed off at this person flipping you off on the highway than like I might be, for example. I might just laugh, haha, right? I might just laugh it off. But there's a parallel track between the conscious and the unconscious. And that's a kind of oversimplification, but I think that it'll work. In the same way, my sense of tarot is always that, or what I say about it is that it won't tell you anything that you don't already know. In the same way that therapy, right, won't really tell you anything that you don't already know. The point is to draw it out and bring what is unconscious to the conscious mind, so that we can work with it. Because if it remains unconscious, it's like you're trying to organize a closet, but you won't open the door, So we have to first open the door, we have to get everything out, and then we can see, what's still useful for us, right? Or what we can put in a different place or whatever, what still has meaning. So I think the same thing is true of say, a tarot reading. I don't use tarot at all for divination unless you want to imagine that the uncovering or the unveiling of things that you already know to be true but cannot quite admit to yourself to be true is a kind of divination. So I think that in the same way, there's a kind of connection here with the moon ritual. In full disclosure, speaking of Freudian psychoanalysis, I was raised by two Freudian psychoanalysts, and I'm very, very adept, and I'm sure that you probably are too. I'm very adept at telling you, where I have various kinds of hangups and, what I'm neurotic about and what my challenges are as a human being or my challenges are as a partner or as a parent or anything. Like, I've got that language for you, But there's a way in which if we continue recycling that same language, it no longer becomes a means of revelation. It just becomes a means of repetition and being stuck and allowing yourself to remain stuck. So if you bring something a little bit different into it, whether that's tarot or a meditation or a moon ritual or whatever you want to call it, if you bring something a little bit different into your sphere of awareness, suddenly you might be able to recognize something that you were not able to recognize before. And that's exactly what's happening in the Renee Gladman exercise, right? You're used to using this kind of language. You're used to understanding things in this particular way. Now, force yourself to try something different. Because if I put a card in front of you, we're talking about whatever it is that, you've gone through, and you have a story about it. You have got your story, you've got your narrative about it. And I say, okay, I pull a card for you, whatever, like I'll pull the magician for you or something like that. And then I can say to you, okay, well, here's what the sort of standard interpretation of this card would be. Here's something that I might suggest you could think about. And then you might start, ruminating on that and suddenly have a thought that comes completely out of left field that really cracks things open for you. So I think that there's a lot to be said, whether it's in the domain of creative or critical writing or just, writing practices in general, or in the domain of personal exploration, of being compelled to try something very, very different. Because even if it's unsatisfying, and I don't know if your moon rituals were unsatisfying, but even if it's unsatisfying, it may have helped you begin to unstick yourself from a position you've gotten stuck in, just because it's the position you've been in for a really long time, or it's the way that, you've oriented yourself towards a situation for a really, really long time. So yeah, it's all about kind of taking yourself by surprise, I think.
I think that there's something, for me, and again, this might partially be because I'm not an academic, but to me, I think the kinds of critical writing that tend to get me the most excited are ones that seem to be more along the lines of what you're describing as experimental critical writing. And it does sort of lead me to this question of, I wouldn't be so bold as to say that traditional scholarly critical writing doesn't have its utility anymore, but I do kind of wonder, like what each one can do that the other one can't. And to me, like when you're talking about, things becoming repetitive because we use the same language over and over again, and what sort of new revelations we can arrive at by coming at things in this sort of more oblique process, or surprising process. To me, those seem like the kinds of revelations that as a reader of critical writing would be the more exciting ones to me, if that makes sense. But I can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so even though I will say, I'm going to say two things that may seem mutually contradictory. One is that in my own personal, my personal professional life, my own professional life, I am, I think, quite clearly tiptoeing away from conventional academic writing. I feel personally as though I've, for the moment, done not all that I really want to do in that domain, but a pretty good portion of what I want to do in that domain. And I'm more interested right now in, one way to put it would be to say writing for a general audience, but I think another way to put it would be doing more and more experimental writing and bringing up, that, but sort of like highlighting that part of my own writing practice. So that said, I am a staunch defender of conventional academic writing, of the most, kind of dry and pedantic and jargonated kind. And that's not all that academic writing is, but I actually love that stuff. So I love us, I love that. I love that dimension of scholarship. I really, really do. And the way that I've heard it put that has been most powerful to me, I heard Heather Love, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and a queer theorist, say specifically of queer theory, people sometimes say queer theory has become so repetitive. People just publish the same paper over and over again. It uses the same rhetoric and the same concepts and just sort of recycles them and maybe moves them around a little bit, but has become really, really repetitious. And Heather Love's response to that was, well, if you know something to be true, you don't say anything else. You continually say the thing that is true. And I was so moved by that, the claim there is that, that queer theory is actually, a kind of science. Right? In the most general meaning of the term, it's a kind of queer science, and it has found things out. And why shouldn't it continually repeat the truths that it has discovered in the public sphere? The same way that you can go into a science classroom and hear, over and over again. Let's say in some science classrooms, some high school classrooms, you can go and hear the theory of natural selection taught over and over again. Why? Because it's true, right? Mm. So I do think that there's something to be said for I don't want to say it's not the utility or the inutility, but there's something to be said, I think, for the kind of stubborn conventionality of some academic writing. And, queer theory is actually a really, really exciting domain of academic writing, and some of the most interesting prose stylists that have ever existed within academia, like Eve Sedgwick, for one, have come from queer theory. But yeah, I was moved by that. I was moved by that as a defense of the discipline. But yeah, so I actually, I love really dry scholarship. I love reading that stuff. I really do.
Well, so the last question that I always ask all of my guests is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I get a lot of poetry in the mail. But I would say the two, I recently just received in the mail a chapbook by a poet named Rosie Stockton. And Rosie is actually a graduate student at UCLA, though not in the English department. So I feel as though I can sort of, pump their book in a kind of unbiased way. And the chapbook is called Pump Jack. And I am just starting to kind of crack into it. But Rosie is one of my favorite poets who's writing now. And their book, Permanent Volta, came out earlier this year. And, I think I said in some other context, in some other interview, that I really think Rosie is sort of the Frank O'Hara for our moment, wow. And I absolutely stand by it. The poetry is incredibly brainy and sexy and warm. And it's the kind of poetry when you read it, you think, I absolutely wish I knew this person, and that's not true of a lot of poetry, quite frankly. I mean, so you can appreciate the work and not think that you ever want to cross paths with the human being that composed it. But I find Rosie's poetry just to be absolutely kind of astonishing. And I love being in the world that they create, even when, there are aspects of the world being described that are quite disturbing or chilling or challenging. It's always a world that feels deeply recognizable to me. And I love their humor and their playfulness and also their political seriousness. So I would commend, Rosie's work to everyone. And so, either you could check out Permanent Volta, which came out from Nightboat, as I said earlier this year, or the new book, Pump Jack, which is out from a press called Other Weapons. That I think is the things that I found most exciting lately.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really had a good time. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes where you can purchase copies of Keats's Odes, A Lover's Discourse, and a link to Anahid's latest piece in the New York Review of Books, Catastrophic Desire. Do be sure to check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcript help is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation and you could find it in the goodness of your heart to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser, not only are there handy links in the show notes for that, but you will also have the knowledge that you've personally made my day better. You can find all of the rest of the show's social media information, email newsletter, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. We'll be back on May 11th with a conversation with poet and hybrid artist Ayesha Reis about her debut book of poetry, Coining a Wishing Tower, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.